everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at day 2 at India Global Forum. My name is Mayban Khadra. I'm a senior business anchor at CNBC, and it's my pleasure to be joined here with amazing speakers. We're going to discuss a very interesting, timely topic, which is the transition to net zero. Please have a seat. And I would like to welcome our speakers. And before I do that, I would just like to do a quick intro about why this panel is such an important one. So, of course, the word is making the transition toward net zero by 2050, but this transition will require many steps, whether it's in the mobility sector, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's the energy sector. They all have to go hand in hand to achieve net zero by 2050. Today in our panel, we're going to be talking about the strategies, the policies, innovation and technology, and what each of these what role will each of these play in making this transition to net zero by 2050. And I'm really happy that we are joined here today by our speakers. I would like to introduce Mr. Hammad Rahman, Head of Asia Pacific Traditional Infrastructure at Mubadala Investment Company. I would like also to introduce Fazil Abdul Rahman, Group VP and Head of Sustainability and Climate Change at TAQA. And joining us virtually is Amit, Prothi, Director General at CDRI. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I would like to start with you, Fazil. And when we talk about green initiatives, and especially when it comes to green energy grids, to what extent do you think that we have positive experience with these? And to what extent do you think that the lessons learned at this sector are positive enough that we can actually adopt them at a larger scale?
Thank you. First of all, good to be back again this year. I was telling Hammad last year, the crowd for climate just before COP28 was much more. But it seems there's much more noise around AI now, and even the climate panels are more about yeah. But coming to the question, I like the fact that you're focusing on grids, because I feel always grids has been, so underplayed in terms of, let's say, the narrative or important when it comes to energy transition. Everyone has been focusing, and still to a great extent focusing just on renewables. But unless you have a grids to connect them to the customers, it's all of no use, right? And in fact, statistically, there is, I think 20% of the global capacity, if I'm not mistaken, is still laid out there, not connected, just because you don't have the grids, right? So clearly, grids is very important, not to be underplayed. And just to copy the classic saying, there's no transition without transmission. But what should be done in grids? Clearly, we are short on the infrastructure globally. Our existing infrastructure needs to be, let's say, refurbished. And then, of course, you have to connect even more infrastructure, and we are looking at 2 to 3 times of our current lines, which you have to get by 2050, right? Which is, if you take a statistics like how much you have to cover, like just putting the wires across the globe, it's a massive number. So within grids, where we see as an interest, and where I think personally, which will be very important, is interconnectors. Because what interconnector does is it optimizes the systems. Because each and every region, countries are having, let's say, either less capacity, or some of them have a lot of spare capacity, and some of them having issues of variabilities, right? So when you're connecting, let's say, each countries or regions or big entities, you can actually optimize the system. I mean, classic example which we have been into is we are connecting at NOx onshore and offshore facilities to the grid. So the idea is, instead of them producing electricity or water of their own, we connect them to the nuclear and solar. A long shot which we announced last year, and the project is still going, is our investment in LexLinks. The idea is we have 15 gigawatt of renewables in Morocco, and we connect them to the UK. Long shot, but we feel there is a future, and that's the way to go ahead. In fact, in last global forum, I was on panel with one of the Indian government representatives. So we picked up the discussion how we could have a UAE-India corridor, which was exciting. So that is one interconnection. Second, of course, we cannot never overlook batteries. It's always there. The cost of batteries are coming down. So, I mean, we still prefer at utility scale, the batteries, the cost to come down. So that is definitely an eye to watch for. And even in the region, let's say in Abu Dhabi, we have already, through the system planner, has already sent out the bids for large-scale battery projects. I mean, we're talking about big numbers now. And last but not the least is digitalization. I think the grids needs to be much more smart. whether it is in terms of, let's say, rectifying the grids, knowing the grids better, serving the customers better, planning the systems better. I think digital plays a key role on the grids. So yeah, interconnectors, batteries, and digitalization for me are three main things within the green grids perspective.
They are, and each of them come with their own set of challenges. I will come to this in a minute, but before I do that, I would like to go to Amit. And Amit, I want to ask you a question that globally it's being asked. It's maybe the $1 million question. Are we doing enough? I mean, when you look at governments globally, are they doing enough to achieve net zero by 2050? And to what extent do you think that there's some sort of divergence between what we're seeing in developed countries and what we're seeing in developing countries?
Thank you so much for having me, first of all, and my apologies that I could not be there in person. I hope you can hear me properly.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So, I'm really coming from a perspective of something called resilience. When you're talking about grids, are we thinking about our grids to be resilient for the changes that we're going to see in the future? That's really the perspective that I come from. I lead an organization called the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. It is an international organization headquartered in Delhi. And what we are really trying to focus on is, when you look at the amount of impact in our energy sectors because of climate change, because of disaster, and given that there is still such a large need to invest in net zero infrastructure, in infrastructure that is, yet to be built, just a broad number, the amount of infrastructure we'll build in the next 20 years is what we built over the last 100 years. So what we are trying to say is, how do you do that in a way where in the future, understood your changing risk profiles? Your wind speeds are changing because cyclonic patterns are changing. You've got precipitation patterns that are changing that is causing flooding. So when we think about our energy infrastructure, how is it being built in a way where extreme heat is understood, where future risk from precipitation is understood, changing wind profile? So for us, really, the discussion starts to be about the resilience of our infrastructure systems. And within that context, to answer your questions, are the countries doing enough? I won't get into what the developed versus developing countries are doing for achieving their targets. From a resilience point of view, I would say a lot of them are still learning how do you start to address the risk of future climate change in your investment decisions for infrastructure today. We're doing a fair amount of work in that space. We're trying to bring out data in the public domain that talks about physical risk. We built a model last year that literally looks at risk to infrastructure sector from 6 hazards. We're deepening that this year to bring extreme heat, which we never really had in the model in the first place, as a risk. We're trying to come up with works to understand how do you look at your vulnerability of your systems? So, for example, along the coast of Odisha in India, cyclonic patterns are changing. And how is that going to affect the energy system? How is that going to affect your grid in the future? And where do you need to put in investment today to enhance it? So let me just stop there, because I think the question is slightly different than where I've taken this to, but I'll come back to it again if you need.
Thank you so much, Amit. I'm going to come back to you with a couple of things that you just mentioned, but I'm going to stay within the topic around what we're seeing globally between different regions. So, Hammad, when you look at Asia Pacific, and from your experience there, which markets do you think they're doing a great job when it comes to integrating climate change policy with infrastructure planning and construction? And what kind of lessons can other regions learn from their experience, from these positive stories, if any?
Firstly, I'm truly grateful to be here, to be part of this forum, and be participating along so many distinguished leaders. If I had to name one country that has set extremely ambitious renewable targets, but at the same time is taking very concrete action to be able to achieve those renewable targets, I think that country would have to be India. Starting with, I think most of us would know this, as you know, India has set an extremely ambitious target of having 500 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030. And I think when that target was set, I think it was back in 2021, everybody thought it was more of a political statement than reality. But now that you look at the progress that India has made over the last 5 years, I think in 2019, there was maybe roughly 80 gigawatts of renewable capacity. 5 years later, it's 200 gigawatts plus. So more than double, the amount of renewable capacity has been doubled. So it's a truly incredible accomplishment, and that 500 gigawatt goal is looking more and more likely. But I think the way the Indian government has thought is very interesting. They've realized that to achieve such a transformative scale of investment, they are going to need, on a very massive scale, lots of private international capital. And so you need to attract a lot of international capital, but also at a reasonable return expectation. Because if international investors come in and are asking for extremely high rates of return, you're never going to be able to scale up those investments. And that's exactly what the Indian government, I think, has been able to achieve by creating a truly robust regulatory environment. And I'll just give you a few examples. The government is supporting international investors with land and grid connectivity. They have offered long-term power purchase agreements, 15 to 20-year plus power purchase agreements. The regulator, SECI, is playing a key role. So one of the key concerns we had when we were starting to look at India was that payments from off-takers would sometimes come very late, sometimes 150 days, 200 days. So the regulator, SECI, has come in and has sort of taken away that risk by sort of being there as a supporter of last resort. Finally, the government has introduced a proper framework for corporate PPAs. So now, when you're trying to sign a power purchase agreement, you don't necessarily need to go to a government off-taker. Now there's a proper framework available where you can actually sign long-term agreements with corporations. And you see a lot of gigawatts of renewables being added. One other country that I'd like to mention that I'm actually very excited about is Singapore. And Singapore, by the way, as most of you might know, today is not really, its share of renewables is quite small. It's primarily gas power generation. But now Singapore has ambitions to install a lot of data centers driven by AI. That's a more interesting topic being discussed in the next hall. But Singapore is one of the ideal locations to put up data centers. Data centers are going to require a tremendous amount of power, which Singapore wants to be powered by green power. And so this shows the innovation that they're bringing in, that they are basically installing large amounts of renewable power generation, not in Singapore, where there's a challenge with space, but in Indonesia and Malaysia. And then they're laying down undersea cables to bring in renewable power from their neighboring countries. Furthermore, Singapore has a lot of gas power, and they're one of the innovators in bringing in hydrogen. So they're starting to co-fire their gas-powered plants through hydrogen, so they can actually greenify their current gas-powered plants. So I think India and Singapore, I think, are sort of prime examples that we should try to emulate.
So you mentioned hydrogen, and Fazil, we hear all these about green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, gas as a transition fuel. When you look at renewables overall and the different sources of green energy, which ones are you most excited about, and which ones, in your opinion, are going to be a great contributor to achieving net zero by 2050?
Oh, Siddhi, it's a very tough question because it's very tough to pick, one single answer because a lot depends on the markets where you're in, because regulations, the off-takers, size of the projects all plays a part in it, right? But if I just quickly skim through some of those, right? I mean, green hydrogen overall has a big prospect. I mean, there's no question about it, right? But let's say compared to 2 years back and now, did we really achieve that momentum? My answer would be not really. There are a lot of barriers around it. Let's say like when Mubadala goes to any market, what he checks, I think that barriers are still there. One is we need a big off-taker for green hydrogen, which still is not happening, although there are good signs of pilots and discussions around that. I think second and foremost is we are looking at an infrastructure which is not, let's say, tuned for hydrogen yet, right? They're not designed for hydrogen intake, outlet, transmission, and so forth. I think talking about transportation, the geopolitics also comes into play. So hydrogen is still a wait and watch, but having said that, all know down the line it is very critical towards a net zero transition. I think the question is when you're going to see a break-even role. Many were expecting, let's say, 2025 in terms of big projects or so, but I see that happening further down the line. So that's the state on hydrogen. Carbon capture is definitely important because the question is, there are a lot of demand is coming up, whether it is in terms of the developing world. AI is a big demand on itself. So can we have renewables to meet all of them unless the technology cost of storage is another
I think carbon capture is extremely important for the region in particular because they depend more
Exactly,
on
because
fossil fuel.
there's a lot of dependency on gas. But the good thing is a lot of gas, new projects which is being commissioned here in the region, whether it is UAE, Saudi, are all CCUS ready, meaning when they need to switch it on, they can switch it on, right? But I would say still they would prefer the cost of CCUS to come down, some sort of mechanism. And there are some governments who are promoting, let's say, CCUS. We had some good examples in IRA in US, whereas others, it might be in the form of carbon market mechanism. But the sheer scale of CCUS in terms of reducing emissions is still critical. So that's always a watched out technology. And I think I would say there are more examples than green hydrogen of CCUS than in the recent years. Blue hydrogen, I think, has kicking off. If not pure forms of green hydrogen, there are a lot of blue hydrogen investments happening. Mainly because that's a good segmentation, to the transition. Rather than completely moving, let's say, the gas business to pure green, pure fired by pure renewable energy. The other colors such as blue is a good transition fuel before they get into the green. So that seems to be more realistic, especially in the developing markets. But again, the point is, irrespective of some of those, the pace is low, doesn't mean we have to stay away from it. The idea is you have to always keep them in your radar in terms of, let's say, your capital allocation or a long-term planning. And you have to wait and watch the market. And more importantly, you continue the stakeholder engagements, which is the governments, off-takers, and the customers. I heard in the last panel someone mentioning examples of, let's say, green steel here. There have been some good pilots announced in UAE. Our entity, Mazda themselves, are having some good examples and case studies to show. It's all about, all the stakeholders coming up and scaling it up so that you get the required number to get the net zero numbers.
You mentioned many of the factors we were discussing earlier, and especially when it comes maybe to infrastructure. And Amit, I've sat with investors, and whenever I raise the topic of investing in renewables and renewable projects, they mentioned exactly the same factors as we are discussing today. First of all, the regulatory framework. Number two, logistics and geopolitical tensions and geopolitics, and to what extent does it play a role? And third, investment in infrastructure as well. From your background, to what extent do you think that making this shift to renewables require a quite different infrastructure, and to what extent do you think that governments are willing to make this transition and spend, I don't know, millions and billions to change the infrastructure to make this transition?
Yeah.
It was like the classical English.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. I think probably
Okay. Is that better? Yeah. So I think, clearly the shift has to happen. I mean, that's a commitment that governments have already made, that they are going to try to meet the demand for net zero through alternative sources. The role of government to spur innovation, to spur opportunities for others to come in is there, and a lot of people are working in that space. I think one thing we have to really acknowledge is when you're thinking about all of the different technologies that we're looking at, for example, solar, wind, etc., etc. The previous speaker made a point about Singapore and how land is such a critical resource. Now, when you start looking at the physical attributions of infrastructure, you need to recognize that certain parts, geography plays a big role there, risk plays a big role there. Understanding that not everywhere you can do the exact same thing. So how do you start to look at this variability on the ground? And from my point of view, which is really about the climate risk, how do you introduce that in a way that when you're investing in a solar farm, You're not losing it because you've not understood that that same location is prone to flooding tomorrow. We've seen examples already where investors have lost value because they have not understood that a certain location may not actually lend itself to would be interrupted over time. So I think part of what we are trying to do is when you're doing your investments, how are you starting to factor in disruptions because of issues of disasters, including climate change? So when you're projecting that I've got an investment in a solar farm, I've got a certain return for the next 30 years, how do you understand that in that next 30 years, you may actually lose productivity for a collective 6 months period because that is prone to cyclones or that is prone to flooding. So what we're trying to really do is introduce data that can help to say, okay, there are certain locations that may be better for certain kinds of infrastructure. Introduce, changing wind maps, for example, changing certain kinds of regulatory, wind maps is something that is done by a standard setting agency. Working with them to say, what are the standards that are now applicable for the future in those locations? So when you're investing in infrastructure, you've got a little bit more comfort in knowing that what I'm investing in will give me the returns that I'm expecting. So in that context, the role of government really becomes, and we are working with a number of governments now, how do you get that data out there? How do you start to introduce standards that are recognizing future risks? And how do you get people trained, building capacity of the decision makers to understand that when we are investing in the long term, thinking about resilience is actually an opportunity as well. I mean, I think we've not talked about this in this forum yet. But if you can understand your long-term risk and then say, if I'm going to lose value because my asset will not be providing me services for 6 months, and that has a cost, if I can translate that into a dollar value and say, if I can make a slightly upfront improvement, I'll actually get that 6 months of service over time. These are discussions that are ongoing right now in the resilience space. This is a discussion that's starting to happen in the G20s. How do you actually understand risk from climate change, and how do you factor that into your cost benefit analysis today, so that you're recognizing that the investment in infrastructure gives you the guaranteed return that you're expecting over its lifetime. Let me stop there.
One of our strategies is to invest in companies that are operating in hard to abate sectors, but they have a credible plan to achieve net zero. So one example is we've invested in a urea manufacturing facility in Australia. Now, urea is one of the hard to abate sectors. It has a very significant carbon footprint. So we've invested with this company called Perdaman Industries. However, Perdaman, at the time that they have started constructing this urea manufacturing plant, have already a credible plan to achieve net zero because they've left a tremendous amount of space to put renewables so they can start powering that facility through renewables, and they have nearby gas fields which they can use for carbon capture. So for us, it's a very interesting story also from an investor's perspective. Over time, there will be carbon taxes and there'll be all kinds of things. And then if you're backing a urea manufacturing facility that is low cost, but at the same time has close to a zero carbon footprint, clearly becomes a very attractive investment value proposition. I'll give example of another company that I think is truly innovative. It's not innovative in terms of technology, but how they think. So we're backing a company called PAG Renewables in Japan. Japan, like all countries, have aggressive renewable targets, but as you know, Japan has limited space. It's a mountainous region. So what this company is doing is it's going to disused farmland and disused golf courses. So Japan, believe it or not, has hundreds of disused golf courses and nobody's using them. So this company is going in and they take that land and they repurpose it and start putting solar farms on it. And then they sort of lump up all of those, and then they sign sort of a long-term corporate power purchase agreement with somebody who wants 50 megawatts. So they're able to do all of that work. But it's a very innovative solution to go and find pieces of land that are not being used. Maybe the farmer doesn't have a good use for it. You give them rent, but then you're able to introduce renewables. And maybe a third example, which is I think relevant for India, and this is one of the most fundamental things we need for renewables, is how do you make renewables sort of not volatile? Because as we know, when the wind is not blowing, when the sun is not shining, you don't get renewables. And so the Indian market has introduced this concept of bidding for round-the-clock renewable solutions, which is you offer a hybrid renewable solution, which is a combination of wind, solar, and storage. So we've invested in Tata Renewables, which is one of the leaders in sort of providing round-the-clock solutions. It's much more complex. It needs a lot of AI and analytics to run. But I think that's another really innovative area that's helping to grow renewables.
Innovation and technology will play a great role in achieving net zero. So I still have 2.5 minutes before we wrap up. And I would like to ask the three of you one question. What would you like to see happening in the next decade when it comes to government policies and government spending to achieve net zero? And I'm going to start with you, Amit, please.
Not there is a marginal cost. If you can invest in that now, you're actually avoiding long-term, So make sure that you're getting maximum efficiency of your investment by paying attention to resilience. To me, that's the critical point. I mean, and I'll just give you an example. We are already seeing that solar panels efficiency is lost because of increase in rise in temperature. We are already seeing the grid getting impacted because of flooding. So I think those are things that do have an aggregated impact on infrastructure investment. So just by paying a little bit more attention, we can be more efficient with our investments.
I can still hope, but I would expect for a regulation where they price ESG financially into the investment decision making. So governments and regulators telling, yeah, this is how much you have to factor into the pricing. But of course, before they do that, they have to also commit how they will be, injecting some cash to the system so that the private sector is not affected. So I would like to see that in action, because at the moment, incorporating the cost of ESG is more of a voluntary decision or a practice, majority still. Yeah.
I think Fazil's already hit on the key points. To accelerate our journey towards net zero, you talked about grids and the fact that we still don't have the right transmission networks to be able to connect all the renewable capacity that's coming online with the people. And I think, Fazil, you also touched on the fact that carbon capture and hydrogen, which are key parts of the story, are still nascent. The costs are too high, the regulatory framework is not there. But I think even more basic, I think I was starting with the example of India, which provides bankable power purchase agreements. And there's still a number of very large emerging Asian economies that are not providing that basic, robust regulatory framework to encourage international investment.
For me, I think what is really going to be game-changing for this will be investors coming in to finance these kind of projects more. I mean, we keep saying that governments should do more and banks should do more when it comes to financing, but I think that investors as well need to pay attention to these projects, renewable projects, and not be so greedy about financing such projects when it comes to the targeted return on investments. With this, we come to the end of this session. Thank you so much for joining us, Amit, Fazil, and Hammad, and thank you so much for being with us today. Of course, we promise you more interesting sessions during the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, May. Thank you.
Thank you all.